In the spring of 1871, the medical establishment of Virginia became transfixed by a phenomenon that contradicted every principle they understood about disease and mortality. Mary, a 43-year-old woman who had spent most of her life in bondage on a tobacco plantation near Richmond, had survived smallpox in 1854, typhoid fever in 1863, and cholera in 1869. Diseases that had collectively killed more than 8 million Americans during the century. She should have been dead 3 times over. Instead, she stood in the examination rooms of Richmond's Medical College, her body covered in the scars of survival, while doctors measured, tested, and studied her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They drew her blood week after week. They catalogued every symptom she could remember from each illness. They recorded every detail of her medical history in leather-bound journals that they kept locked in their offices. And what they discovered, or perhaps more accurately, what they did with their discovery, would remain buried in the basement archives of the institution for over 80 years, hidden behind decades of dust and deliberate silence. Before we continue with the story of Mary and the doctors who became consumed by her impossible immunity, if you're fascinated by stories of medical mysteries and dark histories that challenge what we thought we knew, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and let us know in the comments which state you're watching from. We love hearing from our community across America. Now let's discover why Mary's survival became both a scientific marvel and something far more troubling. The question that haunted the medical journals of 1871 was deceptively simple. How had she survived when millions had perished? But the answer they would pursue, and the methods they would employ to find it, would reveal something darker than any disease. It would reveal the lengths to which educated, civilized men would go when they stopped seeing a human being and started seeing only a puzzle to be solved. Richmond, in the years following the Civil War, was a city trying to rebuild itself from ashes, both literal and figurative. The former capital of the Confederacy had been burned in the evacuation of April 1865, when retreating Confederate forces set fire to warehouses and armories to prevent Union forces from capturing supplies. The fires had spread uncontrollably, consuming more than 20 city blocks before Union troops arrived and organized firefighting efforts. 6 years later, the scars of that destruction still marked the landscape like wounds that refused to heal. Entire blocks remained empty, their foundations overgrown with weeds that pushed through cracked brick and mortar. The James River, that vital artery of commerce that had once carried tobacco and cotton to ports and profit, now flowed past warehouses that would never be filled again. The grand homes on Franklin Street stood with broken windows, their porticos sagging, their gardens returned to wilderness. On the streets, men who had fought for the Confederacy walked beside those who had opposed it, an uneasy peace maintained through mutual exhaustion and the practical necessity of survival. The population of Richmond had changed dramatically. Before the war, the city had been home to approximately 38,000 people, nearly half of whom were enslaved. Now, in 1871, the freed population faced a precarious existence. Emancipation had given them legal freedom, but little else. No land, no resources, no education, no capital. Most remained exactly where they had always been, working the same land for the same families, receiving wages that were immediately consumed by rent and overpriced supplies sold by their employers. The system had been redesigned with different paperwork, but the power dynamics remained largely unchanged. But amid the ruins, one institution had not only survived, but expanded. The Medical College of Virginia, established in 1838 on East Marshall Street in the Egyptian Building, a remarkable structure designed to resemble an ancient Egyptian temple with columns that tapered upward and hieroglyphic-inspired decorations. The building had been designed to inspire confidence in modern medicine through the aesthetic of ancient wisdom. During the war, it had served as a Confederate hospital, treating thousands of wounded soldiers in its halls and in the surrounding buildings that were commandeered for medical use. The college's faculty had witnessed every conceivable injury and disease during those 4 years of war. They had amputated limbs by the hundreds, operating on rough wooden tables while cannon fire echoed in the distance. They had treated gangrene, dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, measles, mumps, and a dozen other diseases that flourished in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of army camps and field hospitals. They had watched young men, boys really, some as young as 15, die from infections that a simple understanding of antisepsis, not yet widely accepted in American medicine, might have prevented. They had operated without anesthesia when supplies ran low, holding down screaming patients while they sawed through bone. Dr. James Calder had been there through it all. At 56 years old in 1871, he was one of the college's senior physicians, a tall man with graying hair that he wore longer than was fashionable, pulled back from a high forehead. His hands were large and weathered, the hands of someone who had done physical labor, though he hadn't in decades. They were steady hands, never trembling even during the most delicate procedures, though they never seemed to stop moving, always reaching for an instrument, adjusting a lamp, writing in one of his many notebooks. Calder had trained at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in the late 1830s, studying under physicians who still debated whether disease was caused by miasmas, bad air rising from swamps and decomposing matter, or by something else, something invisible that passed from person to person through contact or contaminated water. The debate had not been settled in his student days, and it remained unsettled still in 1871, though new theories from Europe, particularly from Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany, were beginning to suggest that specific microorganisms caused specific diseases. Calder believed in observation, in documentation, in the careful accumulation of facts. He kept meticulous records of every patient he treated, filling leather-bound journals with notes written in his precise, slightly slanting hand. Each entry included the patient's name, when known, age, symptoms, progression of disease, treatments administered, and outcome. His journals from the war years filled an entire shelf in his office, a chronicle of suffering and death that he sometimes paged through late at night, looking for patterns, searching for understanding. He had married young, at 24, to a woman named Catherine who had given him 3 children before dying of puerperal fever, childbed fever, after the birth of their youngest daughter in 1849. The baby had died too, 3 days after Catherine. Calder had been unable to save either of them, despite all his training, despite his knowledge and his careful attention. He had watched his wife slip into delirium and fever and death, and he had understood then how little medicine truly understood about the fundamental processes of disease. That understanding, or rather, that acknowledgement of ignorance, had driven much of his subsequent career. He needed to know. He needed to understand why some people died and others survived. The woman he would come to know simply as Mary first entered his life, not as a patient, but as a subject of inquiry, a puzzle presented to him in a letter that arrived in late February of 1871. The letter was from Thomas Waverley, who identified himself as the proprietor of Waverley Tobacco Plantation in Henrico County, about 15 miles east of Richmond. Waverley wrote that he employed a woman with an extraordinary medical history. She had survived 3 major epidemic diseases over the course of 17 years. He had heard that the medical college was interested in studying disease resistance and immunity, and he wondered whether the college's physicians might wish to examine this woman. He was willing to bring her to Richmond for study, though he would require compensation for her lost labor time. Calder read the letter twice, then immediately wrote a response. He was intensely interested. He offered Waverley $50, a substantial sum, nearly 3 months' wages for a laborer, for permission to study the woman over a period of several months. Waverley agreed, and arrangements were made. Calder knew nothing about Mary beyond what Waverley had written in his letter. He didn't know her full name. Waverley had referred to her only as Mary, no surname. He didn't know whether she could read or write, whether she had family, what she thought about being brought to Richmond to be studied by white doctors. These questions didn't occur to him, or if they did, they seemed irrelevant to the scientific endeavor. She was a subject, a case study, an opportunity to learn something about the mechanisms of disease resistance that might save countless lives in the future. Her personal feelings and experiences were incidental to that larger purpose. It was a perspective that was unremarkable among physicians of his time and place. The recently ended era of slavery had accustomed white Americans, particularly white Southerners, to treating black people as objects rather than subjects, as bodies rather than persons. Even physicians who opposed slavery on political or moral grounds often shared this fundamental perspective when it came to medical research and education. The bodies of enslaved people had been used for anatomical dissection, for experimental surgeries, for testing new medical procedures. J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology, had developed his surgical techniques by operating on enslaved women without anesthesia, believing they felt less pain than white women. His work was celebrated. He was not unusual. Calder would have insisted that he bore Mary no ill will, that he respected her as a human being. And in his own understanding, this was true. But his respect existed only in the abstract. When faced with the concrete choice between Mary's well-being and his scientific curiosity, between her autonomy and his research goals, the outcome was never in doubt. On a cold morning in March of 1871, Thomas Waverley loaded Mary into his wagon and drove her into Richmond. The wagon ride took most of the morning. Mary sat in the back, wrapped in a thin shawl against the March cold, watching the countryside give way gradually to city. She had been to Richmond only 3 times before in her entire life, once as a child when the plantation owner had brought several of his workers to carry purchases from the market, once during the war when they had fled the plantation briefly ahead of Union troops, and once 2 years ago to attend the funeral of a distant cousin. Each time, the city had seemed overwhelming. So many buildings crowded together. So many people. The noise and smell and constant movement. She was 43 years old, though she wasn't certain of the exact date of her birth. Her mother had told her she had been born in late summer of 1828, but whether it was August or September, she didn't know. There had been no one to record such details for enslaved children. What mattered was whether they would survive infancy, whether they would grow strong enough to work. Mary had survived and grown strong. She was of medium height, with powerful shoulders and arms from decades of agricultural labor. Her face bore the unmistakable pitted scars of smallpox, and her hands were calloused and marked by countless small injuries, cuts from tobacco leaves, burns from cooking fires, the permanent staining of fingers from handling fresh tobacco. She had been born on a plantation in southern Virginia, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who had died in childbirth when Mary was 7 years old. The baby, a boy, had died too. Mary's father, she had been told his name was Samuel, a man from a neighboring plantation, but she had no memory of ever meeting him. After her mother's death, Mary had been raised communally by the other women on the plantation, sleeping in their cabins, learning to work alongside them in the tobacco fields. Her life had followed the rhythms of tobacco cultivation, planting in spring when the threat of frost had passed, the long hot summer of weeding and worming, picking the hornworms off the plants one by one, harvesting in late summer and fall, then the winter work of stripping and grading the dried leaves. It was hard work that bent the spine and wore down the body, but Mary had discovered she was good at it. Her hands were quick and nimble at stripping leaves. She could judge the quality of tobacco by touch and smell. These skills gave her a certain value, which translated into slightly better treatment. More food, a cabin that didn't leak quite as badly, fewer beatings. She had been married twice briefly. The first time when she was 17, to a man named Jacob, who had been sold away 6 months later. The second time when she was 24, to a man named Thomas, who had died of pneumonia 3 years into their marriage. Both marriages had been informal, not legally recognized. Enslaved people could not legally marry, but recognized by the community. She had loved Thomas, or at least she thought she had. It was hard to remember now, 20 years later. After he died, she had not married again. She had 2 children, a daughter, Ruth, born when Mary was 22, and a son, Daniel, born when she was 29. Ruth still lived on the Waverley plantation, working in the main house now, cooking and cleaning. She was 21, smart and careful and quiet. Daniel had been sold when he was 12, during the war, when Thomas Waverley's father had needed money. Mary didn't know where he was now. She had spent years hoping he was alive somewhere, hoping he had survived the war and emancipation and was living free somewhere in the north. But she didn't know. The not knowing was worse than grief, because grief could eventually soften and heal, while not knowing remained sharp forever. These were the things Mary thought about as the wagon rolled toward Richmond. Thomas Waverley sat up front, driving the horses, occasionally speaking to them but not to her. He had explained very little about what would happen in Richmond. The doctors wanted to examine her, he had said. They wanted to understand why she had survived diseases that killed so many others. It would take a few hours. She should answer their questions honestly. It would be fine. Mary didn't believe it would be fine. In her experience, nothing involving white men's attention was ever fine for someone like her. But she also understood that she had no choice in the matter. Waverley owned the plantation where she lived and worked. He didn't own her. The 13th Amendment had ended that. But the distinction felt thin and academic. She worked for him because there was nowhere else to go, no other work available, no land of her own to farm. If he said she was going to Richmond to be examined by doctors, then she was going to Richmond to be examined by doctors. Her preferences were not relevant. The medical college building appeared ahead, its distinctive Egyptian-style columns visible from several blocks away. Waverley guided the wagon to the front entrance and climbed down. "Come on then," he said, not unkindly. Mary climbed down after him, her legs stiff from the long ride. Inside, the building smelled of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that made Mary think of death. Later she would learn it was ether, used to anesthetize patients during surgery, but on that first day it simply smelled wrong. Dangerous. The hallways were painted a pale green color that was supposed to be calming but somehow wasn't. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. A young man in a dark suit met them in the lobby. A medical student, Mary guessed, though he didn't introduce himself. He led them up a staircase to the second floor and down another hallway to a door marked Examination Room 3. He knocked, opened the door and gestured for them to enter. The room was perhaps 15 feet square, with a single high window that let in weak morning light. There was an examination table in the center, a desk against one wall with papers and instruments scattered across it and several chairs. 3 men stood as they entered. All 3 wore dark suits. All 3 were white. All 3 looked at Mary with an expression she couldn't quite read. Interest, certainly, curiosity, but also something else. Something that made her want to step backward, back into the hallway, back down the stairs, back into the wagon and away. "Mr. Waverley," said the tallest of the 3 men, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. James Calder. Thank you for bringing her." They shook hands. Calder turned to Mary. "And you're Mary. Thank you for coming." He didn't extend his hand to her. "She doesn't have much choice about it," Waverley said with a slight laugh. "But she's cooperative. You shouldn't have any trouble." "Excellent. Gentlemen, this is Dr. Robert Hayes." He indicated a younger man with dark hair and a neat beard. "And Dr. William Marshall." The third man, perhaps in his early 30s, clean-shaven, with pale eyes that didn't blink often enough. "We'll be conducting the examination together. Mr. Waverley, you're welcome to wait downstairs. This will take several hours." Waverley nodded. "I have business in town anyway. I'll return this afternoon, say around 3 o'clock. That should be sufficient." Waverley left, closing the door behind him. Mary was alone with the 3 doctors. "Please sit," Calder said, indicating the examination table. Mary sat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. Calder opened a notebook and picked up a pencil. "I'd like to start with some questions about your medical history, Mr. Waverley wrote that you survived smallpox, typhoid fever, and cholera. Can you tell me about the smallpox first? When did you become ill?" Mary spoke slowly, searching her memory. It was the year after my first husband was sold, so that would be 1854, I think. Summer. July, maybe, or August. How did the illness begin? I had a fever first, and a headache, a bad one. I thought it was just the heat at first from working in the fields, but then I started feeling cold even though it was hot, and my back hurt, and I felt sick to my stomach. When did the rash appear? After a few days, maybe 3 days. It started on my face and then spread to my arms and body. Describe the rash. Mary hesitated. It had been 17 years, and she had tried not to think about it. There were spots, red at first, then they turned into bumps, and then the bumps filled with fluid. They were all over me. My face, my arms, my chest, my legs, everywhere. Did the lesions rupture? Some of them. They crusted over eventually, and when the crusts fell off, they left these. She gestured at her scarred face. Calder was writing rapidly. How long were you ill? I don't know exactly. Maybe 3 weeks, a month. I was in the sick barn with the others. 11 of us died. I thought I would too. What treatment did you receive? Mary almost laughed at that. Treatment. We were given water and some food when we could eat it. Nobody wanted to come near us. They left food at the door and ran away. No medical attention at all? No, sir. Calder exchanged glances with the other doctors. Hayes looked troubled. Marshall's expression hadn't changed. Tell me about the typhoid. Calder continued. When did that occur? During the war. 1863, I think. Winter. She described the symptoms. The fever that had climbed day by day. The weakness. The stomach pain. The strange rose-colored rash on her abdomen. She had been sick for nearly a month that time. Delirious for much of it. Cared for by other women who risked infection to bring her water and broth. 5 people had died. Mary had survived, though she had been weak for months afterward. And the cholera? 2 years ago. Summer of 1869. That one she remembered vividly. The terrible diarrhea and vomiting, the cramps in her legs and stomach, the thirst that couldn't be satisfied. Her cabin mate Sarah had died in her arms, her skin turned grayish-blue, her eyes sunken. Mary had been certain she would die too, but after 2 days of agony her symptoms had begun to ease. After 5 days, she was weak but recovering. After 2 weeks, she was back at work. Calder asked more questions. Had anyone in her family survived similar diseases? Had she taken any special medicines or remedies? Had she noticed anything unusual about her health in general? Mary answered as best she could. No one in her family that she knew of. No special medicines. Her health was generally good. She got minor colds sometimes, occasional stomach trouble, but nothing serious. She was strong. She healed quickly from cuts and injuries. After an hour of questions, Calder set down his pencil. Now we need to conduct a physical examination. Please remove your dress and undergarments. Mary had known this was coming. Waverley had warned her. But knowing didn't make it easier. Her hands shook slightly as she unfastened her dress, a worn brown cotton garment that had been mended many times. She stepped out of it, then hesitated. Everything, Marshall said. His voice was flat, clinical. We need to examine the full extent of the scarring. She undressed completely, standing naked in the center of the room, while the 3 doctors studied her like she was a specimen in a jar. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her breathing, trying to be somewhere else in her mind. Calder approached first, circling her slowly. He didn't touch her, just looked, occasionally writing in his notebook. Extensive scarring consistent with severe smallpox infection, he murmured. Approximately, what would you say, 200 visible pox scars? 300? At least, Marshall agreed. Concentrated on face, upper arms, chest, and back. Less extensive on legs and buttocks. Hayes came forward with a measuring tape. I need to take some measurements, he said quietly, and something in his tone made Mary glance at him. He looked uncomfortable, his face slightly flushed. He measured her height, the reach of her arms, the circumference of her upper arms, her wrists, her thighs. He worked quickly, efficiently, not meeting her eyes. When he was done, he stepped back and wrote the measurements in a separate notebook. Marshall examined her face closely, tilting her head to catch the light from the window. His fingers were cold against her jaw. "Significant facial scarring," he said. "The disease must have been quite severe. I'm surprised she survived." "The fact that she did is why we're interested," Calder said. They examined her for another 30 minutes, looking in her eyes, her ears, her mouth, checking her reflexes, pressing on her abdomen, listening to her heart and lungs with a stethoscope. Then came the part Mary had been dreading. "We need to collect a blood sample," Calder said. He was already preparing the instruments, a small scalpel, several glass vials, clean cotton cloths. "Sit on the table, please, and extend your left arm." Mary sat. Her arm felt heavy, disconnected from her body. She watched as Calder made a small cut in the crook of her elbow. It hurt less than she expected, just a sharp sting. But watching her blood flow out, dark red into the glass vials, that made her feel dizzy and sick. She thought of Sarah dying, her body emptied of fluid. She thought of all the blood spilled during the war, soaking into the ground, staining the rivers. They collected 3 vials of her blood, then pressed cotton against the cut until it stopped bleeding. Calder wrapped a bandage around her arm. "You can dress now." She dressed as quickly as her shaking hands allowed. When she was covered again, she felt a little less vulnerable, though she knew it was an illusion. They had seen everything. They had documented her body in their notebooks. She could never be fully covered again. Not from them. "We'll need you to return for additional examinations," Calder said. "Twice weekly for the next few months. Mr. Waverly has agreed to this arrangement. We'll examine you, collect blood samples, ask further questions. What we learn from you may help us understand disease immunity, which could save countless lives. Do you understand?" Mary nodded. She understood that she would be coming back here, that she would be examined again and again, that her blood would be taken and studied, that she had no choice in any of it. She understood that her survival, which she had thought was her own, was something that belonged to her, was now something that belonged to science, to these doctors, to a pursuit of knowledge that didn't ask her permission. "Good," Calder said. "You can wait downstairs for Mr. Waverly." She left the examination room and made her way down the stairs on legs that felt unsteady. In the lobby, she sat on a bench and waited. Through the tall windows, she could see people passing on the street, men in suits, women in fine dresses, children running. Life continuing normally while upstairs, in a room that smelled of death, 3 doctors discussed her body and her blood and what they might learn from her. Thomas Waverly arrived at 3 o'clock, as promised. "All done?" he asked cheerfully. The doctors satisfied. "Yes, sir," Mary said quietly. "Good, good. They're paying well for this, you know, and all you have to do is sit there and answer questions. Easy work." He laughed, pleased with himself, with the arrangement, with the $50 he was earning for Mary's cooperation. On the ride back to the plantation, Mary said nothing. She looked at the countryside passing by and thought about her blood in those glass vials, being studied under microscopes, being mixed with chemicals and diseases. She thought about the doctor's eyes examining her naked body, their hands measuring her like she was a piece of furniture. She thought about having to return to that building, to that room, twice a week for months. And she thought about Sarah dying in her arms, and about all the others who had died from the diseases she had survived, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether surviving had been a blessing or a curse. The examinations fell into a routine. Every Tuesday and Friday, Thomas Waverly would drive Mary to Richmond in his wagon. She would spend 3 to 4 hours at the medical college while the doctors examined her, drew her blood, asked their endless questions. Then Waverly would drive her back to the plantation, and she would return to work, to the familiar rhythms of tobacco and soil and exhaustion. At first, the examinations were bearable. Mary learned to distance herself mentally during the physical inspections, to let her mind drift while strange hands measured and prodded her body. She answered their questions as best she could, dredging up memories of fevers and pain that she had tried to forget. She watched them draw her blood week after week, filling vial after vial with the red fluid that they seemed to think held some secret. But as the weeks turned to months, something began to change. The doctors became more intense, more focused. Their questions grew stranger. They wanted to know every detail of her life, not just her medical history, but everything. What did she eat? Where did she sleep? Had she ever been intimate with someone who was sick? Had she ever traveled outside Virginia? Had she ever been bitten by any animal? Had she consumed any unusual foods or medicines? Dr. Marshall was particularly persistent with these questions. He had a theory, he explained one day in May, that disease resistance might be related to prior exposure to related diseases in childhood. Perhaps you had mild cases of other illnesses when you were young, he suggested. Illnesses that trained your body to fight similar diseases later. Mary tried to remember her childhood illnesses. There had been fevers, certainly, rashes, times when she had felt sick. But every child got sick. She couldn't remember anything unusual, anything that would explain why she had survived when so many others had died. Hayes, the younger doctor, seemed less certain about the examinations. Mary noticed that he looked uncomfortable when they asked her to undress, that he kept his eyes averted when possible, that his measurements were quick and perfunctory. Once, when the others had stepped out of the room briefly, he had spoken to her. "Does this hurt?" he asked, indicating the small cut they had just made to draw blood. "Some," Mary admitted. "I'm sorry," he said, and seemed to mean it. "But what we're learning from you truly could help others." Mary didn't know how to respond to that. How could her blood, which looked the same as anyone else's blood, help anyone? But she said nothing. Hayes seemed like a kind man, relatively speaking. But he was still a white doctor, and she was still a formerly enslaved woman, and the distance between those two positions was vast and unbridgeable. Calder spent hours studying her blood under his microscope, comparing samples taken at different times, mixing her blood with various substances to see how it reacted. His journals from this period, meticulous as always, reveal his growing frustration. Mary's blood appeared completely normal. There were no obvious differences from the blood of other subjects. Her red cells looked like everyone else's red cells. The white cells appeared normal. There was nothing visibly special about her blood. Yet she had survived 3 deadly diseases. The contradiction gnawed at Calder. There had to be an explanation, something he was missing. Disease didn't spare people randomly. There had to be a mechanism, some biological factor that protected her. If he could identify it, isolate it, he might be able to replicate it, to create some kind of treatment or preventive that could save thousands of lives in future epidemics. By June, Calder had accumulated dozens of pages of notes about Mary. Her measurements, her medical history, descriptions of her scars, analyses of her blood at various dilutions and temperatures. But he was no closer to understanding why she had survived. The answer remained elusive, taunting him from just beyond his reach. It was during this period that Mary began to understand the true nature of what was happening. She was not being examined to help her. She was being examined to help science, to help future people who might get sick. Her own well-being was incidental to that larger purpose. When she felt faint after they drew too much blood, they gave her water and had her rest for a few minutes, but they didn't draw less blood the next time. When she expressed discomfort or fear, they noted it in their journals. Subject appears anxious, but they didn't change their procedures. Her feelings were data points, nothing more. She began to dread the twice-weekly trips to Richmond. On Monday nights and Thursday nights, she slept poorly, knowing what the next day would bring. She would lie in her cabin listening to the sounds of the plantation at night. Distant voices, dogs barking, the wind in the trees, and wonder how long this would continue. Waverley had said a few months. It had already been 3 months, and there was no sign of the examinations ending. She spoke about it with her daughter Ruth one evening in late June. They were sitting outside Ruth's cabin, where Ruth lived with 2 other women who worked in the main house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Mama, you look tired," Ruth said, studying her mother's face. "Are the doctors hurting you?" "Not exactly," Mary said. "They take my blood. They examine me. They ask questions. It doesn't hurt much, but it feels—" She struggled to find the words. "It feels like they're taking pieces of me, like I'm getting smaller." Ruth frowned. "Can you tell Mr. Waverly you don't want to go anymore?" Mary laughed bitterly. "Tell him?" "Ruth, I can't tell him anything. He's being paid for this. Why would he stop?" "Maybe if you explained—" "Explained what? That I don't like being studied like a bug under glass? That I'm tired of strange men examining my naked body? You think that would matter to him?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wish Papa was here. He would know what to do." Mary felt a surge of grief at the mention of Thomas, her second husband, dead now for 16 years. "Your papa was a good man," she said, "but even he couldn't have stopped this. This is how the world works, Ruth. We survive the best we can, and sometimes surviving means enduring things we don't want to endure. That doesn't seem fair." "No," Mary agreed. "It doesn't." As summer deepened, the heat in Richmond became oppressive. The examination room on the second floor of the medical college had no ventilation, and the single window did little to relieve the stifling air. Mary would sit on the examination table, sweat running down her back, while the doctors conducted their tests. They seemed less affected by the heat, though she noticed Hayes sometimes loosening his collar and Calder occasionally wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. In July, they began a new series of tests. Calder had obtained samples of various disease materials, blood and fluids from patients with typhoid, cholera, and other illnesses. He wanted to mix these samples with Mary's blood and observe what happened under the microscope. Would her blood somehow attack the disease materials? Would it destroy the organisms that caused illness? "This is entirely safe," he assured Mary when he explained the tests. "We're conducting these experiments on glass slides under the microscope. Nothing will be injected into your body. We simply want to see if your blood has properties that destroy disease organisms." Mary watched as he drew 4 full vials of her blood that day, more than he had ever taken before. She felt dizzy afterward and had to sit with her head between her knees for several minutes before she could stand. They gave her water and a piece of bread and told her to rest. After 20 minutes, they said she was fine to go. On the wagon ride back to the plantation, she felt weak and strange. Her head ached. Her arm, where they had cut her, throbbed with a dull pain. She held onto the side of the wagon to steady herself, focusing on the road ahead, trying not to vomit. "You all right back there?" Waverly called from the front. "Yes, sir," Mary lied. "Good. The doctors say they're making real progress. They're pleased with how you're cooperating. Keep it up, and this will all be over soon." But it didn't feel like it would be over soon. It felt like it would go on forever. An endless cycle of examinations and blood draws and questions, her body studied and measured and reduced to data in leather-bound journals. That night, Mary developed a fever. It was mild, perhaps 100 degrees, but it frightened her. She hadn't been sick in 2 years, not since the cholera. Was this connected to the blood they had taken? Had they somehow infected her with one of their disease samples? The fever broke by morning and she felt better, but the fear remained. She realized she was completely at the mercy of these doctors, that they could do anything to her in the name of science, and she would have no recourse. If they made her sick, accidentally or deliberately, who would hold them accountable? Certainly not Thomas Waverly, who was being paid $50. Certainly not the medical college, which wanted the research to continue. She was entirely alone in this, she realized. More alone than she had been even during slavery, because at least then her body had had some value to her owner, some reason to be protected. Now she had no value except as a source of data. Her suffering was acceptable, even necessary for the advancement of knowledge, and summer was only beginning. By August, Dr. Calder's experiments with Mary's blood had yielded nothing but frustration. He had mixed her blood with disease samples at every conceivable temperature and concentration. He had compared her blood to samples from dozens of other subjects, volunteers from the college, patients in the hospital, other formerly enslaved people whom Thomas Waverley and other plantation owners brought in for small payments. Nothing distinguished Mary's blood from anyone else's. Under the microscope, typhoid bacteria remained alive and motile in her blood, just as they did in other blood samples. Cholera organisms showed no particular weakness to her blood serum. The physical properties of her blood were unremarkable. Her red blood cell count was normal. Her blood clotted at normal speed. Its color, consistency, behavior under various conditions, all normal. By every measure Calder could devise, Mary's blood was ordinary, and yet the historical fact remained incontestable. She had survived 3 epidemic diseases that collectively killed millions of people. There was an explanation. There had to be. Calder simply hadn't found it yet. He began reading everything he could find about immunity and disease resistance. He subscribed to medical journals from Philadelphia, New York, Boston, even some from Europe. He read about Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccination work from the late 1700s, about how exposure to cowpox seemed to prevent smallpox. He read the emerging theories about germs and disease from Pasteur and Koch. He read older texts about variolation, the practice of deliberately exposing people to smallpox matter to create immunity. A pattern began to emerge in his reading. Exposure to disease often created resistance to future exposures of the same disease. People who survived smallpox almost never got it again. People who had mild cases of diseases sometimes developed immunity without severe illness. The body somehow learned to recognize and fight specific diseases after initial exposure. But Mary's case didn't fit this pattern neatly. She had survived 3 different diseases, not repeated exposures to the same one. Unless there was some connection between the diseases, or unless her body had some general disease-fighting capacity that was stronger than normal. He wrote letters to colleagues in other cities, describing Mary's case and asking for their thoughts. The responses were mixed. Dr. Anthony Pierce from Philadelphia suggested that Mary might simply be lying or confused about her medical history, that perhaps the diseases had been less severe than she remembered, or that she had confused her own illnesses with those of others around her. Calder dismissed this. He had verified the outbreaks through plantation records and Waverley's confirmation. Dr. Ellen Richards from Boston, one of the few women physicians in America, wrote a thoughtful response, suggesting that some people might simply have more robust constitutions, that the variation in human health and disease resistance was not yet well understood. "We tend to seek specific mechanisms," she wrote, "but perhaps the answer is simply that human variation is broader than we acknowledge. Some people are naturally stronger, heal faster, resist disease better. We don't know why. Perhaps we won't until we understand much more about human physiology." Calder found this answer unsatisfying. It amounted to saying that Mary survived because she survived, that her resistance to disease was explained by her resistance to disease. It was circular reasoning, not an explanation at all. Dr. William Marshall had a different idea. One humid afternoon in mid-August, the 3 doctors met in Calder's office to discuss the case. Papers were spread across Calder's desk, his notes on Mary, journal articles, letters from colleagues. The window was open, but no breeze stirred the heavy air. "We're approaching this wrong," Marshall said, leaning back in his chair. "We've been studying her blood outside her body in artificial conditions. We're never going to understand her immunity that way. We need to observe how her body responds to disease in real time, from the moment of exposure through the entire course of illness and recovery." Calder set down the paper he'd been reading. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we deliberately expose her to disease under controlled conditions." There was a moment of silence. Hayes, who had been standing by the window, turned around. "You want to infect her?" "I want to conduct a controlled experiment," Marshall clarified. "We select a disease. Typhoid would be ideal, since she's survived it once and should theoretically be resistant. We expose her to a measured dose of typhoid bacteria. We monitor her constantly, document every stage of her body's response. We'll have her in the hospital, under medical supervision 24 hours a day. Any symptoms that develop will be treated immediately, and what we learn could be invaluable. Or we could kill her, Hayes said flatly. She survived typhoid once already. The probability of survival is high, and we'll be providing better medical care than she received during her first infection. She was left in a barn with minimal attention. This time she'll have constant monitoring, proper hydration, medications. She'll actually be safer than she was the first time. Calder was quiet, thinking. The proposal troubled him, but he couldn't immediately articulate why. They deliberately infected people all the time for vaccination purposes. Variolation had been practiced for decades, deliberately exposing people to small amounts of smallpox matter to create immunity. This was different, certainly, because they weren't trying to prevent disease but to study it. But the principle was similar, controlled exposure for a beneficial purpose. The ethical concerns are substantial, he said finally. I agree, Marshall said, but weigh them against the potential benefits. If we can understand the mechanism of disease resistance, we might be able to create treatments or preventatives that could save thousands of lives in the next epidemic. Cholera killed over 20,000 people in the last major outbreak. Typhoid kills tens of thousands every year. If we can learn something that prevents even a fraction of those deaths, isn't that worth some risk? Risk to her, Hayes pointed out. Not to us. Not to the thousands who might benefit. To one woman who has no say in the matter. She has no say because Waverly has legal authority over her employment, Marshall said. That's the reality of her situation. We're not creating that reality. We're working within it. That doesn't make it right. Right is a philosophical question. I'm interested in scientific questions. Calder held up a hand before the argument could escalate. Let me think about this. It's a significant step, deliberately infecting a human subject. I need to consider it carefully. Over the next week, Calder found himself unable to think about anything else. He weighed the potential knowledge against the certain risk to Mary. He thought about the soldiers he'd watched die during the war, the children killed by scarlet fever and diphtheria, the women dead from puerperal fever. He thought about his own wife and infant daughter, dead from an infection he couldn't prevent or treat. Medicine advanced through experimentation, through pushing boundaries, through taking risks. But who should bear those risks? His dreams that week were troubled. He dreamed of Catherine dying, her skin burning with fever while he stood helpless beside her bed. He dreamed of Mary, naked in the examination room, her body covered with suppurating smallpox lesions, while he took notes. He dreamed of jars filled with blood, rows and rows of them in the college basement, each labeled with a name he didn't recognize. He consulted the college's administration. The dean, Dr. Philip Somerset, was an elderly man who had led the institution through the war years and was primarily concerned with its financial survival. When Calder explained the proposed experiment, Somerset considered for a moment and then asked, "Is Waverly's consent sufficient legally?" "I believe so. She's employed by him, and while slavery is ended, the legal precedents regarding employment authority are similar. And the potential scientific value is substantial." "It could be. We might learn something significant about disease immunity. Then proceed. Document everything carefully. If you're going to take a risk like this, make sure the documentation is thorough enough to justify it to posterity." Calder left the meeting feeling both validated and disturbed. Somerset had given permission, but had also acknowledged it as a risk, as something that would need to be justified to future generations. That acknowledgement suggested doubt, uncertainty about whether this was truly justified. But Calder had made his decision. On a Tuesday morning in early September, he informed Marshall and Hayes that he was approving the experiment. Hayes protested, but was overruled. Marshall immediately began preparations, obtaining a fresh culture of typhoid bacteria from a patient currently hospitalized with the disease. They didn't tell Mary what they were planning. They simply asked her to come in on a Friday instead of the usual Tuesday, and when she arrived, they told her she would be staying at the hospital for observation. "For how long?" she asked, alarm evident in her voice. "A few days," Calder said. "We want to monitor your health more intensively. You'll be comfortable. You'll have a private room, regular meals, constant medical attention." Mary didn't believe him. She knew something was different, something wrong, but she also knew she had no choice. She let them lead her to a small room on the hospital ward, a space perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a single bed, a chair, a small table, and a window that overlooked East Marshall Street. She sat on the bed and waited for whatever was going to happen next. Dr. Calder and Dr. Marshall entered Mary's hospital room together on the morning of Friday, September 8th, 1871. Hayes was not with them. He had asked to be excluded from this particular procedure, and Calder had reluctantly agreed. Through the window, Mary could see people walking on the street below, going about their normal lives, unaware of what was about to happen in this room. "Mary," Calder began, his tone measured and professional, "we're going to try something different today. Based on our months of study, we believe that exposing you to a small amount of typhoid bacteria under controlled conditions will help us understand how your body fights disease. This is important research that could save many lives." Mary stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're going to make me sick." Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. "We're going to expose you to the disease," Marshall clarified. "Your body may not become sick at all. That's part of what we're trying to learn. You survived typhoid fever once before, which suggests your body has developed resistance. We want to observe whether that resistance is complete or partial and how your body responds to exposure. If you do develop symptoms, they will likely be mild and we'll treat them immediately. You'll be here in the hospital where we can monitor you constantly." "But what if—" Mary started, then stopped. What was the point of asking questions? They had already decided. She could see it in their faces, in the prepared syringe on the table, in the notebook already open in Calder's hands. "What if what?" Calder prompted gently. "What if I die?" There was a pause. "You survived typhoid before," Marshall said. "There's no reason to think this time would be different. In fact, you'll have better care this time than you did during your first infection." "I don't want to," Mary said. She said it quietly, without much hope, but she said it. Calder looked uncomfortable. Marshall's expression hardened slightly. "Mary, you need to understand that this research is larger than any individual. The knowledge we gain from this study could help us develop treatments that save thousands of lives. Your contribution to medical science is valuable. I don't want to contribute to medical science. I just want to go home. Mr. Waverly has given his consent for this procedure," Marshall said, his voice taking on a sharper tone. "Legally, that's sufficient. We're explaining this to you as a courtesy, but your personal preference is not the determining factor here." And there it was, the reality she had known all along, but had perhaps allowed herself to forget during the months of examinations that, while uncomfortable, had seemed relatively harmless. She was not a person making choices about her own body. She was a subject, a research specimen, and the decisions about what happened to her were made by others. "Please," she said, one last attempt, "please don't do this." Calder looked away. Marshall showed no reaction. "Drink this," Marshall said, handing her a glass of water. The water had been mixed with typhoid bacteria. Mary didn't know this yet, couldn't have known just by looking at it. It appeared clear, normal, harmless. Mary took the glass with a hand that trembled slightly. She looked at it, then at the two doctors watching her. For a moment she considered throwing the glass against the wall, refusing, fighting. But what would that accomplish? They would force her eventually, or they would punish her in other ways. Resistance was futile when you had no power. She drank the water. It tasted slightly bitter, but not unbearably so. When the glass was empty, she set it down on the table beside the bed. "Good," Calder said, making a note in his journal. "Time of exposure. 9:47 a.m., September 8, 1871. Method: oral consumption of typhoid culture, approximately 20 milliliters. Subject was cooperative. He paused, then added, subject expressed reluctance, but complied after explanation. Mary lay back on the bed. There was nothing to do now but wait and see if she would die in this room, in this hospital, under the observation of men who cared more about their journals than about her life. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. Mary remained in her hospital room, examined every 6 hours by one of the doctors. They took her temperature with a glass thermometer that she had to hold under her tongue for several minutes. They checked her pulse, counting beats while consulting their pocket watches. They asked how she felt. She felt fine, physically. Mentally, she was terrified, waiting for the sickness to begin. She ate the meals they brought her, simple food, bread and soup, and occasionally some meat, and tried to sleep, though sleep came fitfully. The bed was more comfortable than her cabin bed, the sheets cleaner, but comfort meant nothing when you were waiting to become gravely ill. Calder came to examine her Friday evening. No symptoms yet, he noted. Temperature normal at 98.4 degrees. Pulse normal. No complaints of headache, nausea, or discomfort. Should there be symptoms by now? Mary asked. Typhoid has an incubation period of 1 to 3 weeks typically, but symptoms often begin sooner with direct bacterial exposure. We're in uncharted territory here. He said this matter-of-factly, as if the uncertainty should be as interesting to her as it was to him. On Saturday, Mary woke feeling warm. When Marshall came to check her temperature at 8 in the morning, it had risen to 99.2 degrees. Slight fever, he noted. Let's monitor closely. By Saturday evening, her temperature was 100.1. By Sunday morning, 101.5. The fever had begun. With the fever came other symptoms. A headache that started dull and gradually intensified, a weakness in her limbs that made even sitting up feel exhausting, a loss of appetite that turned the smell of food nauseating. Marshall sat in the chair beside her bed, writing in his journal, documenting everything. Describe the headache, he said on Sunday afternoon. Mary's mouth felt dry. They had been giving her water constantly, but it never seemed enough. It's behind my eyes and at the back of my head. It gets worse when I move. Scale of 1 to 10, how severe? She didn't know how to answer that. How did you measure pain numerically? 7, she guessed. Nausea? Yes. Abdominal pain? Some. Not terrible yet. Marshall wrote for several minutes. Mary watched his pencil move across the page, forming words about her suffering, reducing her fever and pain to data points. On Monday, her fever reached 103 degrees. The headache became a constant throbbing presence. She developed abdominal cramps that made her curl on her side in the bed. They gave her laudanum for the pain, which helped somewhat, but also made her thoughts fuzzy and confused. Calder and Hayes came to examine her Monday evening. Hayes looked troubled as he checked her pulse and listened to her heart. Her heartbeat is rapid, he said. She's becoming dehydrated despite our efforts. Increase the fluids, Calder ordered. We need to keep her hydrated. That's crucial. How high can we let the fever go before we intervene more aggressively? Hayes asked. We'll monitor. If it reaches 106, we'll take measures to reduce it. For now, we observe. For now, we observe, Hayes repeated, and there was something bitter in his tone. While she suffers. She survived this disease before, Marshall reminded him. She'll survive it again. We just need to document the process. But lying in the bed, burning with fever, Mary wasn't certain she would survive. She remembered her first bout with typhoid during the war, the weeks of delirium, the certainty that she was dying. She had survived that time through sheer chance and stubbornness, but chance might not favor her twice. On Tuesday, her fever climbed to 104 degrees. She became delirious, calling out names of people long dead. She called for her mother, dead 36 years. She called for Thomas, her second husband, dead 16 years. She called for Sarah, her cabin mate who had died of cholera, in her arms. The doctors noted this in their journals. Subject experiencing delirium. speaking incoherently to deceased individuals. Wednesday was worse. Her fever reached 105 degrees. The characteristic rose-colored rash of typhoid appeared on her abdomen. She alternated between shivering violently and burning up, throwing off the blankets, and then crying for them moments later. She couldn't keep down food, could barely sip water without vomiting. Hayes confronted Marshall and Calder that afternoon in Calder's office. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to stop this." "Stop what?" Marshall demanded. "The disease is running its course. What would you have us do? Bleed her like it's 1771 instead of 1871? We're giving her the best care available, constant fluids, laudanum for pain, monitoring. Now we wait and we document. We deliberately infected her. We made her this sick. For the advancement of medical knowledge," Marshall shot back. "How many typhoid victims have you seen die, Hayes?" "I've seen hundreds. I watched my wife die of it. If we can learn something from this that helps us prevent those deaths, then yes, it's worth one woman being sick for a few weeks. What if she doesn't survive? She will. She survived before. You don't know that. You're gambling with her life." "All of medicine is gambling," Marshall said coldly. "Every surgery, every treatment, every new technique, it's all risk-balanced against potential benefit. This is no different." "It's completely different," Hayes insisted. "In surgery, we're trying to help the patient in front of us. Here, we're harming her deliberately to potentially help theoretical future patients." "Enough," Calder interrupted. "The decision has been made. We proceed." Hayes left the office without another word. That evening, he sat with Mary during his shift, watching her toss and turn in fevered delirium. She was mumbling something he couldn't quite make out, fragments of sentences that made no sense. He moistened a cloth with cool water and placed it on her forehead, though he knew it would do little to lower her temperature. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, though she probably couldn't hear him. "This shouldn't have happened. Just when we thought the situation couldn't get more dire, something unexpected occurs. If you're invested in Mary's story, hit that like button and subscribe to support content that brings forgotten histories to light. Share this with someone who appreciates dark, true stories. Now let's see what happens as the fever reaches its peak. On Thursday morning, September 14th, 6 days after the infection, Mary's fever reached its highest point, 105.7 degrees. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch. Her pulse was rapid and weak. She was barely conscious, responding only minimally to questions or stimuli. Calder made the decision to apply cool compresses to try to bring down the fever. They soaked cloths in cold water and placed them on her forehead, neck, wrists. They sponged her body with cool water over and over, trying to lower her temperature through evaporative cooling. It was one of the few interventions available to them. By Thursday evening, her fever had dropped slightly to 104.2. By Friday morning, it was 103.8. The crisis seemed to be passing, though she remained very ill. On Saturday, September 16th, 8 days after the infection, Mary's fever broke. She woke in the morning lucid for the first time in days, asking for food. Her temperature had dropped to 100 degrees. By evening, it was 99.2. Her body was winning the battle. Marshall was elated. "Do you see?" he said to Hayes. "Her body fought it off, just as it did before. This is unprecedented data. We've documented the entire course of the disease from the moment of exposure. We have temperature readings every 6 hours, observations of symptom development, notes on her body's response at every stage. This is invaluable." But Calder, examining Mary on Saturday evening, felt troubled. She had survived, yes, but the cost had been enormous. She had lost at least 10 pounds. Her face was gaunt, her arms thin. She was so weak she could barely sit up without assistance. And this was from a disease they had given her deliberately, in a controlled environment with medical supervision. What if something had gone wrong? What if her fever had climbed higher, beyond what the human body could survive? They would have killed her for data that, in the end, told them little more than what they had already known, that Mary's body could fight typhoid fever. What was the point? He asked Marshall later that evening. What did we learn that justified this? Marshall looked surprised by the question. We learned how her immune response works. We documented her recovery time. We observed the progression of symptoms in someone with prior exposure to the disease. We can compare this data to other typhoid cases, look for patterns, try to understand the mechanisms of immunity. We learned nothing we couldn't have learned by examining typhoid patients who got sick naturally, Calder said quietly. We deliberately caused immense suffering for data we could have obtained without deliberately infecting anyone. Marshall's expression hardened. If you're developing a conscience about this, Doctor, it's a bit late. What's done is done, and the data is valuable whether you choose to see it that way or not. Calder had no response to that. Marshall was right in a sense. It was too late for conscience. They had already done it. The question now was what they did with the knowledge they had gained, and whether it would ever truly justify what they had put Mary through. Mary remained in the hospital for 3 weeks total. The first week after her fever broke, she was too weak to leave the bed. The second week, she could sit up, walk a few steps with assistance, eat small meals. The third week, her strength gradually returned, though she remained thin and tired. The doctors continued to examine her throughout her recovery. They documented her weight gain, her returning appetite, the normalization of her vital signs. They drew more blood samples, comparing her post-infection blood to samples taken before the infection, looking for differences. Again, they found nothing remarkable. Her blood recovered just as anyone else's blood would have. During those 3 weeks, Mary had time to think. She thought about what had been done to her. Not the smallpox or typhoid or cholera that she had survived naturally, but this typhoid that had been given to her deliberately. They had made her think she would die. They had watched her suffer and had written notes about her suffering. They had valued their journals more than her well-being. She understood now that she was not a person to them. She was a mystery to be solved, a source of data, an opportunity for research. They spoke politely to her, answered her questions sometimes, ensured she had food and water. But these were the same courtesies they would extend to a valuable animal, a horse perhaps, something that needed to be kept healthy for practical reasons. She thought about her daughter Ruth, about whether she knew where Mary was, whether she was worried. She thought about the other women on the plantation, about the work they were doing while she lay in this hospital bed. She thought about Sarah, who had died of cholera in her arms, and about all the others who had died from diseases she had survived. She had thought her survival meant something, that perhaps her suffering had purpose. But now she understood. Her survival meant only that she was useful to these doctors. And when she was no longer useful, when they had learned whatever they could learn from her, she would be sent back to the plantation and forgotten. Hayes visited her several times during her recovery. He seemed uncomfortable, unable to meet her eyes for long. Once he asked, How are you feeling?" It was such an absurd question that Mary almost laughed. "How do you think I'm feeling?" "I'm sorry," he said. "I argued against this. I want you to know that. But you didn't stop it." "I couldn't. I'm the youngest, the least senior. My opinion doesn't carry much weight." "Then your apology doesn't mean much either," Mary said, not angrily, just stating a fact. Hayes had no response to that. He finished his examination in silence and left. By the end of September, Mary was deemed healthy enough to return to the plantation. Thomas Waverley came to collect her in his wagon, paid the additional fees for her extended stay, and thanked the doctors for their valuable research. "How do you feel?" Waverley asked cheerfully as they rode back to the plantation. "The doctors said you were sick for a while there." "Yes, sir," Mary said quietly. "But you're all better now. That's good. And you helped medicine advance. That's something to be proud of." Mary said nothing. There was nothing to say. She watched the countryside pass by, the same fields and trees and roads she had seen hundreds of times before, and felt a distance from everything, as if she were watching the world from behind glass. When they arrived at the plantation, Ruth came running out of her cabin. "Mama!" She hugged Mary tightly. "Where were you? Mr. Waverly said you were at the hospital, but wouldn't say why. I was so worried." Mary hugged her daughter, feeling how real and warm and solid she was. So different from the doctors with their cold instruments and colder eyes. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm home now." That night, lying in her own cabin bed, Mary couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the hospital room, about drinking the water that made her sick, about the fever and delirium. She thought about Calder's notebook, about all the observations and measurements and temperature readings he had recorded. Somewhere in that building in Richmond, her suffering existed as data in a journal. Her fever was numbers. Her pain was described in clinical terms. Her fear was noted as "subject appears anxious." She survived, but she didn't feel like a survivor. She felt like something that had been used up. Over the following weeks, she tried to return to normal life. She worked in the tobacco fields, though she tired more easily than before. She spent evenings with Ruth and the other women, listening to their talk, occasionally contributing a word or two. But part of her remained back in that hospital room, waiting for the fever that had been given to her deliberately, understanding finally that her life had value only as raw material for someone else's purpose. She had nightmares. In them, she was back in the examination room, naked under the doctor's eyes, while they measured and prodded and took pieces of her. Or she was in the hospital bed, burning with fever that climbed higher and higher until she was on fire, while doctors stood around with notebooks writing, always writing. She would wake gasping, her heart pounding, uncertain for a moment where she was. "Mama, you were crying out in your sleep again," Ruth said one morning in October. "It's nothing, just dreams." "Dreams about the hospital?" Mary didn't answer. Ruth sat beside her on the bed and took her hand. "What did they do to you there?" "They studied me. They wanted to understand why I survived diseases that killed others." "Did they find out?" "No. They learned nothing except that I'm no different from anyone else. I just got lucky, I suppose, and my luck got me noticed, and being noticed got me this feeling, like I'm not quite real anymore. Like I'm something in a journal instead of a person." Ruth squeezed her hand. "You're real, Mama. You're the most real person I know." Mary wanted to believe that, but she wasn't sure she did. Life continued. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. Mary worked the tobacco fields, survived the seasons, grew older. The doctors in Richmond did not contact her again. The examinations ended. She was no longer useful to them, she supposed. They had gotten what they wanted. Their data, their observations, their journals filled with notes about her impossible survival. She tried not to think about those months in 1871, but the memories surfaced at unexpected times, when she got a fever from a minor cold and panicked briefly, thinking of typhoid. When she passed the Egyptian building in Richmond on one of her rare trips to the city. When she overheard people talking about diseases and epidemics. The memories were scars as permanent as the smallpox pits on her face, invisible but always present. In 1875, Mary turned 47. Her hair was beginning to grey. Her hands, already weathered from decades of fieldwork, had become arthritic, the joints swelling on cold days. But she was still strong, still healthy. She still didn't get sick often. Her body still healed quickly from minor injuries. The thing that had made her interesting to the doctors remained, whatever it was. Ruth married in 1876, a quiet ceremony conducted by a traveling preacher, followed by a modest celebration with the other plantation workers. Her husband was a man named Jacob, not the same Jacob who had been Mary's first husband. But the name was the same, and Mary felt an echo of old pain hearing it. This Jacob was a good man, a carpenter who worked on the plantation maintaining buildings and equipment. Ruth moved into his cabin. And a year later, Mary became a grandmother when Ruth gave birth to a daughter named Catherine. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Mary felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tightness that had lived there since 1871. This child was new, unmarked by suffering, full of potential. This child had never been studied by doctors or reduced to data in a journal. She was purely herself, purely human. "She's beautiful," Mary whispered. "She has your eyes, Mama," Ruth said. Mary looked at her granddaughter's dark eyes and hoped they would see a better world than she had seen. But hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing. The years continued to pass. Mary grew older, slower, more tired. By 1880 she was 52 and finding the fieldwork increasingly difficult. Waverley, recognizing her declining physical capacity, moved her to lighter work, helping in the plantation kitchen, mending clothes, supervising younger workers. It was easier on her body but harder on her pride. She had always been strong, had always been able to work as hard as anyone. This forced acknowledgement of her aging felt like failure. In 1885, Thomas Waverley died of a heart attack at age 58. His son, Robert Waverley, inherited the plantation. Robert was younger, more business-minded, less paternalistic than his father. He saw the workers more purely as labor resources, less as people for whom he had any responsibility. Conditions on the plantation gradually worsened. Wages were cut, rations reduced, housing repairs neglected. Mary, now 57, found herself thinking more about the past. She thought about her mother, who she barely remembered. She thought about her husbands, both dead for decades. She thought about her son Daniel, sold away during the war, his fate unknown. She thought about the diseases she had survived and the ones she had been given deliberately. One evening in 1887, sitting outside her cabin watching the sun set, Mary tried to make sense of her life. She had survived so much: slavery, diseases, loss, betrayal by doctors who had used her body for their purposes. She had outlived most of the people she had known in her youth. She had watched the world change from slavery to nominal freedom that felt much the same as bondage. She had suffered and endured and survived. But what did survival mean? Was it victory or merely the absence of death? She had survived smallpox, typhoid, cholera. But Sarah had died. Thomas had died. 11 people in that barn in 1854 had died. Why them and not her? The doctors had tried to find out and had failed. There was no explanation, no reason, no purpose. She had simply lived while others had died, and her living had become something for others to study and use. Ruth found her sitting there an hour later, still watching the darkening sky. "Mama, are you all right?" "I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" "About whether my life has meant anything." Ruth sat down beside her. "You raised me. You're there for your granddaughter. You've survived things that would have killed most people. Your life means plenty. The doctors didn't think so. To them, my life only mattered as something to study." "The doctors were wrong," Ruth said firmly. "You're more than what they wrote in their journals." Mary wanted to believe that. Some days she could. Other days, she felt like nothing more than a collection of data points, a puzzle that had never been solved, a mystery that had proven disappointingly ordinary. In 1891, Mary turned 63. She was old by the standards of her time and place, older than most people born into slavery ever lived to be. Her body was failing gradually, her arthritis had worsened, her eyesight was dimming, her hearing fading. She could no longer work even light duties and was essentially retired, supported by Ruth and Jacob, who shared their food and gave her a small room in their expanded cabin. She spent her days sitting outside when weather permitted, watching her granddaughter Catherine, now 15 and beautiful, go about her work. She dozed often, her dreams mixing memory and imagination until she wasn't always certain which was which. She thought about death occasionally, without fear. She had faced death so many times that it had become familiar, almost friendly. In the summer of 1892, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the plantation, addressed to Mary. Letters almost never came for the workers. Most couldn't read anyway, and Robert Waverly was surprised enough to bring it to Ruth's cabin himself. "A letter for Mary," he said, handing it to Ruth. "From Richmond, looks like. Medical College of Virginia." Ruth thanked him and waited until he left before opening the letter. Mary couldn't read, but Ruth could. She had learned from Catherine, her daughter, who had been taught by a traveling teacher who spent a few months on the plantation in the mid-1880s. Ruth read the letter aloud. It was from Dr. Robert Hayes. "Dear Mary, I hope this letter finds you well. I have thought of you often over the years, since our work together at the medical college. I am writing to you now because I believe you deserve to know what became of the research we conducted, and to offer an explanation, however inadequate, for what we did. First, I must tell you that the deliberate infection experiment we performed in 1871 yielded no significant scientific insights. We learned nothing from making you ill that we could not have learned from observing naturally occurring cases of typhoid fever. Dr. Calder and I both came to recognize this in the years following the experiment. The suffering we caused you was not justified by the knowledge gained. Second, I want you to know that I have lived with regret about my participation in that experiment for the past 21 years. While I argued against it at the time, I did not do enough to stop it. I continued to participate in your care, even while believing the experiment was wrong. For this, I am deeply sorry. Third, I want to inform you that Dr. James Calder died in 1889 of pneumonia. Before his death, he expressed similar regrets about the experiment. He had hoped to write to you himself, but never did. Dr. William Marshall left Richmond in 1874 and is now practicing in Baltimore. I have not been in contact with him. Finally, I want you to know that you were more than a research subject to me, though I failed to treat you as such at the time. You were a person who had survived extraordinary circumstances, who showed remarkable strength and resilience. The medical establishment used you poorly. I used you poorly. No scientific advancement can justify that. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. I am writing merely to acknowledge what was done to you, and to say that it was wrong. With sincere regret, Dr. Robert Hayes. Ruth finished reading and looked at her mother. Mary's face was unreadable. "Do you want to respond?" Ruth asked after a moment. "What would I say?" "I don't know. Whatever you feel." Mary was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I don't feel anything. He's sorry. Fine. That doesn't change what happened. That doesn't give me back the weeks I spent thinking I would die in that hospital. That doesn't erase the nightmares I had for years afterward. Do you want me to write back and tell him that? No. Let him sit with his regret. That's his burden to carry, not mine." But despite her words, the letter affected Mary. For days afterward she thought about it, about Hayes and his regret. Part of her felt vindicated. They had finally admitted the experiment had been wrong, had been unjustified. But vindication felt hollow. It came 21 years too late. It changed nothing about what had happened. She thought about Calder, dead now for 3 years. He had expressed regret too, according to Hayes, but not enough regret to write to her himself, to offer an apology while he was still alive. His regret had been private, personal, something he felt but did not act upon, and Marshall in Baltimore probably not thinking about her at all. Mary decided not to respond to the letter. She had survived the diseases naturally, had survived the disease they gave her deliberately, had survived the decades since. She had survived their study of her. She would survive without their apologies too. In the fall of 1893, Mary did something she had never done before. She decided to tell her story. She couldn't write it herself, but her granddaughter Catherine, now 17 and literate, could write it down. "Why now, grandmother?" Catherine asked when Mary proposed the idea. "Because I want there to be a record. The doctors have their journals, full of numbers and observations and clinical notes. I want there to be my words too. I want someone to know what it felt like, not just what it looked like from the outside. Over the following months, Mary told her story to Catherine, who recorded it in a notebook purchased with money she had saved from selling vegetables at the market. Mary spoke slowly, sometimes pausing for minutes at a time to remember or to find the right words. Catherine wrote it all down, Mary's life in her own voice. She talked about her childhood, about her mother dying, about learning to work tobacco. She talked about her marriages, about her children, about Daniel being sold away. She talked about surviving smallpox, typhoid, cholera, what each disease had felt like, how she had been certain each time that she was dying, how she had somehow lived anyway. And she talked about the doctors, about the examinations, the blood draws, the questions, about being studied like something less than human, about the day they gave her the water that made her sick, about the fever and the delirium and the certainty that she was dying, about the nightmares that followed. I survived the smallpox when I was young, she dictated to Catherine one afternoon. I survived the typhoid during the war. I survived the cholera after. I thought surviving meant I was strong, that my body knew how to fight. The doctors said they wanted to learn from me, to understand. I thought maybe my suffering could mean something, could help others, but they made me sick on purpose. They watched me burn with fever, and they wrote in their books, and they didn't care that I was frightened. They didn't care that I thought I would die in that room, alone, because they wanted to see what would happen. I don't feel strong anymore. I feel like something they used up. I survived, but I don't know why, and I don't know if surviving was worth what it cost. Catherine stopped writing, tears in her eyes. Grandmother, keep writing, Mary said gently. This is important. Someone needs to know. When the story was complete, perhaps 50 pages in Catherine's careful handwriting, Mary asked Ruth to keep it safe. Don't throw it away when I'm gone, she said. Maybe someday it will matter to someone. Ruth promised to keep it. Mary died on November 3rd, 1894 of heart failure. She was 66 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep in Ruth's cabin, surrounded by family. Her granddaughter Catherine was holding her hand. Ruth wrote a letter to Dr. Hayes, informing him of her mother's death. She included several pages copied from Mary's dictated journal, the sections about the 1871 experiments. She wanted Hayes to know what his research had done to Mary, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically. Hayes received the letter 3 weeks later. He read it sitting at his desk in his office at the medical college, where he was now head of the internal medicine department. He was 52 years old, respected in his field, successful by any objective measure. And as he read Mary's words he had never heard, perspectives he had never considered, he felt something break inside him. They watched me burn with fever, and they wrote in their books, and they didn't care that I was frightened. He read that line over and over. It was true. They had watched her suffer, and had documented her suffering, and her fear had been merely something to note in their journals. Subject appears anxious. He went to the college archives that afternoon, searching through boxes of old records until he found Calder's journals from 1871. He read through the entries about Mary, seeing them now through different eyes. Every measurement, every observation, every clinical note, all of it suddenly seemed monstrous, a reduction of a human being to data points and specimen descriptions. In the margins of one page, Calder had written, "The scientific method requires such experiments. Progress demands sacrifice." But Mary had not offered to be sacrificed. She had been sacrificed without her meaningful consent, her suffering deemed acceptable for the potential benefit to others. Hayes considered writing his own account of the experiments, perhaps publishing something that honestly addressed the ethical dimensions. But what would it achieve? Mary was dead. Calder was dead. The experiments were history. Exposing them now would damage the college's reputation, might undermine public trust in medical research. And medical ethics had evolved. Such experiments would never be conducted in 1894, not with the profession's growing understanding of patient rights and the importance of consent. He decided to do nothing publicly. But privately, he began advocating within the medical college for clearer ethical guidelines regarding human experimentation. He pushed for requirements that subjects must give informed consent, that experiments must have clear therapeutic or scientific justification, that the well-being of the subject must be the primary concern. His advocacy was noted, but not particularly influential. Medical ethics would evolve slowly, driven not by individual conscience but by accumulated scandals and abuses that finally became impossible to ignore. Hayes kept Mary's letter and the copied pages of her journal in a folder in his desk. He read them occasionally late at night when he couldn't sleep. They were his penance, his reminder of what he had participated in, what he had failed to prevent. Ruth kept the full version of Mary's journal carefully preserved in a wooden box. She shared it with Catherine, who shared it with her own children. It became a family history passed down through generations. The story of Mary, who survived 3 epidemics and was then made sick by doctors who wanted to study her. The doctors' journals, Calder's detailed notes of the examinations and experiments, remained in the medical college archives. Over the decades, they were moved, reorganized, sometimes nearly lost amid institutional changes and renovations. The college became part of Virginia Commonwealth University. The building that had housed the examination rooms was renovated many times. The Egyptian building survived, a landmark, its history preserved, but selective in what it chose to remember. In 1957, during a renovation of the college's oldest building, workers clearing out the basement found boxes of old medical records. A medical historian reviewing the materials found Calder's journals from the 1870s and recognized their potential historical significance. He catalogued them, wrote a brief article for a medical history journal about disease research in the post-Civil War South. Mary was mentioned in the article as Subject M, her real name omitted, her story reduced to a few sentences about a woman who survived multiple diseases and participated in immunity research. The deliberate infection was mentioned as an experiment that would be considered ethically problematic by modern standards, but was not described in detail. The article generated no significant attention and was quickly forgotten. The journals returned to the archives, properly catalogued this time, available to researchers but rarely consulted. Mary's story was now available to anyone who cared to look, preserved in clinical language in leather-bound journals, stored in climate-controlled archive boxes. But her own voice, her own perspective, her own account of what had been done to her, that remained in her family, passed down through generations who kept her memory alive. In 1976, Mary's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Ellen Hayes, she had taken her husband's surname, coincidentally the same as the doctor's, was researching her family history. She found Mary's journal, carefully preserved in its wooden box, and was stunned by what she read. She contacted the Virginia Historical Society and donated copies of the journal pages, along with Ruth's letter to Dr. Hayes and his original letter of regret. The Historical Society accepted the materials and filed them in their collections. A researcher stumbled across them in 1983 and wrote a short article for a local history magazine about Mary's experiences. The article was read by perhaps a few hundred people and then forgotten. Mary's story never became famous. There was no scandal, no investigation, no reckoning with what the medical college had done. Her survival remained a medical curiosity, unexplained by the doctors who studied her. Modern immunology has given us better tools for understanding disease resistance. We know now about antibodies, about immune memory, about genetic factors that influence susceptibility to disease. But why Mary specifically survived when so many others died remains unknown. Perhaps it was genetics, perhaps prior exposure to related pathogens, perhaps simple chance. The answer died with her. What we know for certain is this: Mary lived for 66 years. She survived smallpox, typhoid fever, and cholera, diseases that killed millions of Americans in the 19th century. She was studied extensively by the medical establishment, her blood drawn and analyzed, her body measured and examined. She was deliberately infected with typhoid fever in an experiment that caused her immense suffering and yielded no significant scientific insights. She lived the remaining 23 years of her life, carrying the psychological scars of that experience, believing, as she wrote in her journal, that she had been used up by people who cared more about knowledge than about her humanity. The doctors who studied her believed they were advancing medical science, potentially saving future lives. They were not uniquely cruel men. They were products of their time and place, working within a system that devalued certain lives and prioritized abstract progress over individual suffering. But their good intentions did not excuse what they did. The knowledge they sought did not justify the suffering they caused. Mary's survival from natural diseases was remarkable. What was done to her in the name of studying that survival was unconscionable. Medical ethics have evolved tremendously since 1871. We have institutional review boards, detailed consent procedures, regulations designed to protect research subjects. We understand now that advancing knowledge does not justify every experiment, that human subjects have rights that transcend scientific curiosity. These protections exist because of people like Mary, not because her case specifically sparked reform, but because her experience was not unique, and eventually the accumulated weight of such cases forced medicine to confront its own practices. But understanding the past doesn't erase it. It doesn't restore what was taken from Mary. The weeks she spent convinced she was dying, the years she lived with nightmares, and the feeling that she was something less than human. It doesn't give her the apology she deserved in her lifetime. It doesn't change the fundamental injustice of what was done to her. What it does is remind us that progress built on suffering is not truly progress. That the pursuit of knowledge without ethical constraints can transform healing into harm. That reducing a person to data, however detailed and carefully recorded, is a fundamental failure to see their humanity. And that Mary, daughter, wife, mother, grandmother, survivor, was always more than the sum of her diseases, more than the mystery the doctors tried to solve, more than the data in journals that still exist in archive boxes. She was a person, and she deserved better. The Medical College of Virginia, now part of Virginia Commonwealth University, has no memorial to Mary. There is no plaque, no acknowledgement of her contribution or her suffering. The building where she was examined and deliberately infected still stands, renovated many times, now housing administrative offices and classrooms. Students pass through it daily, unaware of what happened on the second floor in 1871. The only tangible evidence of Mary's existence beyond her family's memories is a brief entry in Thomas Waverley's plantation records, now housed in the Virginia Historical Society archives. Mary, born 1828, deceased 1894, field worker and kitchen assistant, notable for disease resistance. 15 words to summarize 66 years of life, to contain all the survival and suffering, all the strength and fear, all the humanity that the doctors measured but never truly saw. In the same archives, in different boxes, reside Calder's journals with their detailed notes of Mary's examinations, and Mary's own dictated journal with her account of what those examinations felt like. They exist side by side, separated by decades and by fundamental differences in perspective. The observer and the observed, the doctor and the subject, the person with power and the person without it. History remembers the doctors. Calder's contributions to disease research are mentioned in histories of American medicine. Hayes is noted for his later advocacy for medical ethics. Marshall published papers that are occasionally cited in historical surveys of immunology. History has largely forgotten Mary, but her story, preserved in fragmented form in archives and family memories, raises questions that remain urgent. Who gets to be a research subject? Who decides what suffering is justified in the name of progress? How do we weigh the potential benefits to future populations against the certain harm to present individuals? And how do we honor the humanity of those whose suffering contributed to medical knowledge, often without their meaningful consent? There are no easy answers to these questions. But perhaps asking them and remembering stories like Mary's is how we prevent future repetitions of the same injustices. Perhaps remembering is how we ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never again becomes divorced from the recognition of human dignity. Mary survived 3 epidemics that should have killed her. She was studied by doctors who wanted to understand why. They never found the answer. Perhaps the real mystery was never why her body survived, but why her humanity was so easily overlooked in the pursuit of that understanding. What do you think about Mary's story? Do you believe the doctor's actions could ever be justified, or did they fundamentally cross a line that should never be crossed? How do we balance the advancement of medical knowledge with the rights and dignity of research subjects? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more forgotten histories that challenge what we thought we knew about American medicine, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates deeply researched historical mysteries. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another dark chapter from America's past.